was actually a smokescreen to avoid focusing on the big killer at present, which is alcohol. And, as I've said, alcohol would probably be illegal if it was discovered today because it's very toxic, which is why you wipe it on your skin to kill bugs. And anyone who thinks it doesn't kill your cells in your body, as well as it kills these bugs, which are pretty tough, needs to read some of the papers. So let's get to the core of this. What is a drug? Why are we concerned about drugs? Well, this is how I was brought up, along with Colin here. That's what scientists do. It's a very efficient way, actually, of getting publications. But then there's another view, which is the political view. And that's David Cameron saying he now regrets what he did. Actually, some politicians are honest. Tim Yeo said, yeah, I used can, I liked it. Yes. And for all I know, he probably still does, but I don't know that. And then, of course, there's the interesting question of the relationship of alcohol to pharmacology, which is the drinks industry. And now this highlights a really fundamental tension in society at present, because the majority of people still do not think alcohol's a drug. Because if it was a drug, you wouldn't be able to buy it in the supermarket, would you? We did a survey in 1995. We managed to get about 105, I think, politicians to answer some questions, and one of the questions we asked them was alcohol a drug? And about 70% of them said no. And we said, is alcoholism a medical disease, a psychiatric disorder, or is it a failure of will? And about 70% of them said it's a failure of will, as they wandered off to the cheapest bar in Britain. And that is a problem. Many of us do not want alcohol to be a drug because we use it, and many of us believe it isn't a drug. The media often take that view. This is the Metro, an offshoot of the Daily Mail, when we published a report 2007 in the Lancet saying that alcohol was pretty dangerous. They still couldn't understand that alcohol was a drug, although the broadsheets by and large get it right. So again, that tension between the sort of two ends of the journalistic spectrum. So what is a drug? Well, this is what I would say, a drug which is a chemical which, when taken, produces physiological changes. That's kind of pretty unremarkable definition of a drug. When we're talking about drugs that people use recreationally, they usually produce pleasurable or desirable effects in the brain, but not always. They can produce damaging effects, and of course that is why we have laws to control drugs. So let's look at some of the damaging effects. And I'm going to compare and contrast alcohol and cannabis, because I think that's the most important distinction we have to review today. And these are two examples of people who've died supposedly from drugs. On this side is Leah Betts. The older ones amongst you will remember that picture of her in intensive care was splashed over many advertising hoardings in the early 90s. It said sorted. And Leah Betts, on her 18th birthday, we think she took about 80 milligrams of MDMA. But her mother, who was a drugs counselor, had told her that if she took MDMA, you had to drink lots of water because otherwise you'd die of dehydration. So she drank about 7 liters of water, and because she wasn't doing anything other than preparing for her birthday party in her own home, she eventually died of water poisoning. So that's an example of misunderstanding how you might deal with the consequences of drugs. On the left-hand side is Gavin Britton. He was a member of the Exeter University golf team, and he died a couple of years ago of alcohol poisoning when he was losing a drinking game. And of course, one of the problems with alcohol is that once you start to drink, you become less competent, so you're more likely to lose in the drinking games. And the whole concept of drinking games occurring in universities is one I find really very disturbing, particularly as often the drinking's being done with money which is subsidized by the taxpayer, IES. And binging kills a lot of people. Here's a pretty typical example. A young lad celebrating his 18th birthday died after downing 3 pints of lager, 5 double whiskies, and 3 double shots of liqueur in less than 40 minutes, just down the road from you. And that's not atypical. His friends thought they were giving him a good time, but in fact they killed him. And this is the most remarkable recent one. Again, and I haven't selected them to be from around here, by the way, but that's just the way it comes out in the press. The Teesside man died after drinking a pint of vodka in 4 seconds. Now, you do kind of wonder what is the point of that, and I don't think he was trying to kill himself. But alcohol does cause a lot of deaths. About 3 people a week, usually young people, die of acute alcohol poisoning. They die of alcohol overdose. And about 10 people a week, young people usually die of alcohol intoxication. And they often die on their birthdays, which is very, very destructive to the family that's left behind. And one of the reasons that cannabis never scores as highly as alcohol on any metric of harm is that you can't overdose on cannabis. It is never lethal, despite what Gordon Brown says. And also in 2004, when the ACMD did its review of date rape drugs, it was very clear that half of all date rapes are just alcohol, and half are alcohol plus other drugs. And the contribution to the other drugs is not clear. There are probably some contributions, but alcohol is the drug that makes most young women vulnerable to rape. And alcohol disorders are very expensive. Here's the recent data, the latest data we have. We'll have new data, hopefully, later this year on the costs of all disabilities of the brain in Europe. But that's the earlier data, the last survey we did, showing that alcohol disorders are almost as expensive as dementias, and drug disorders are about 1/3 as expensive. So these are huge social costs from those drugs. And we're seeing now an epidemic of hospital admissions caused by alcohol. So in 1995, 96, there were 93,500 admissions for alcohol-related disorders. And 10 years on, that had gone up over to 208,000. And last year, there were 1 million hospital events related to alcohol, of which 13,000 were under 18s. And you contrast that with MDMA, ecstasy, where about 2,000 events, and cannabis about 700. So alcohol is a disproportionate burden on the health service. And there's a lot of social damage. Until the Gulf oil spill, Exxon Valdez was the largest environmental disaster, the largest oil spillage, and it was because the captain was drunk. And most of the Polish parliament was wiped out last year because the general deriving or dictating the flight and the decision to land in the fog was drunk. And we've seen in the UK a number of politicians, most notably recently Charles Kennedy, but people of my generation remember George Brown, who fought alongside Harold Wilson for the leadership of the Labour Party. Their careers were significantly truncated by their alcohol problems. And you all know people, and none of you here, I'm sure, don't know someone whose career has failed to achieve its optimum because of drink. So why has that happened? Why are we having this wave of alcohol-related damage? Well, here you see what's changed over the last 50 years. And that dotted line going up here at 1971 is relevant because that'll emerge on the cannabis slide as well. And what you see from 71 to about now, the red line is the amount of alcohol drunk, which has gone from about 7 litres in 71 to up to about 11 litres in 2006. So a roughly doubling of the amount of alcohol that on average the British person drinks. And the affordability of alcohol is in the blue line. And you can see the affordability has gone up in parallel. So the more affordable alcohol becomes, the more people drink. And these are the red bars are the hospital admissions I showed you. So what we're seeing is that this rise in alcohol consumption, which particularly started in the early 70s, 20 years on is leading to this wave of deaths as a consequence, mostly of cirrhosis. And if we look back over those 40 years, and 71 is an important time because that's when the Misuse of Drugs Act was brought in. That's why I use that starting point. Deaths, standardized mortality rates from every organ system, apart from the liver, have gone down. But the liver has gone up and up and up. And liver deaths will, within 10 years, exceed heart deaths as the major cause of death in this country. So we have an epidemic, a tsunami of liver-related damage that we're doing nothing about. And it's going to become a huge burden on us, the NHS, and anyone who's still paying tax. Now, what about cannabis? Well, that's Alan Johnson, for any of you. I think, judging by the I think that's me by the moustache, I'm not sure. In the same time, since 1971, cannabis use has gone up 20 times. So in 1971, it was about 500,000 users, and then on the data we have here was about 9.5 million. So a 20-fold increase in cannabis use over the last 40 years. Has there been a similar tidal wave of damage? Well, no. The only damage that people think cannabis is doing is psychosis and schizophrenia. And if anything, that's falling. And that's true of all Western countries where we've seen a similar massive increase in cannabis use with no obvious health effects either on the brain or elsewhere in the body. So when you look at those data, although cannabis probably does make a minor contribution to schizophrenia, the ACMD, when it did its third cannabis report in 2009, pointed out that to one case of schizophrenia, you'd have to stop 5,000 young men from ever smoking cannabis. So it's not a public health measure. There is no point in using cannabis smoking as a way of reducing the incidence of schizophrenia. It's a complete red herring. Another way of looking at these data is to look at the size of the user group and the proportion who are going to die from using the drug. So the pies are the size of the users, and the red sectors are the proportion of users who will die from the drug. So you see tobacco, somewhat smaller than alcohol, but half of all tobacco smokers die of a tobacco-related disease. It's about 20% for alcohol. For cannabis, it's a vanishingly small amount, maybe 2%. For heroin, about 20% die of heroin. And MDMA, well, we don't know, maybe certainly less than 1%. So the proportion of deaths in users is grossly higher in alcohol and tobacco. And based on those kind of data and a lot more analysis, we published this paper in The Lancet just a couple of months ago. And you may have seen this. It got quite a lot of press coverage. And what it shows in the blue bars are the relative harm that the drug does to the user, and the red bars, the harm drug does to society, and the total is the total. And you can see that alcohol comes out more than heroin or crack cocaine or methamphetamine. And that's largely because the red bar for alcohol is so large, because the social impact of alcohol is so enormous, the social damage is so enormous. And again, a lot of media interest. This was rather a good cartoon in the Telegraph. But you know, it may be closer to the mark than you might think. So that's the problem. The problem is that we have legal drugs which are very, very harmful. We have some illegal drugs which may not be very harmful. So how do we control them? Well, we have quite a complicated system of control in this country. Medicines in the blue circle are controlled under the Medicines Act by the Department of Health, the Medicines Healthcare Regulatory Authority. Recreational substances are controlled under the Misuse of Drugs Act. We're one of the only two countries in Europe where we separate recreational drugs from the Department of Health. And that's one of the problems, is that, of course, the Home Office is about law and order. It's not about health. On the right-hand side here, we've got cat and coffee. You all know what coffee is. Cat is a chewable form of coffee that is used by people from East Africa predominantly. And it's just taxed. It's vatted when it comes into the country. On the left-hand side, alcohol, tobacco, and solvents. Those are more dangerous drugs. They're also, the government's known for centuries, they're more addictive drugs. People like to have them, so they tax them more heavily. And they regulate the sales through age limitations as well. Now, one of the problems with this particular construction is that many drugs fall into both acts. So many drugs which are used recreationally are also medicines. And that presents all sorts of challenges because they can leak from medical use, and also the attempts to control them may have a negative impact on their use medicinally. And we see that all the time with a lot of concern about under-prescribing of analgesics for terminal cancer patients because doctors are frightened that they might get addicted to the heroin just before they die. You also need to know a little bit about the Misuse of Drugs Act, because it was actually a really clever piece of legislation. It was devised by Jim Callaghan when he was Home Secretary, brought into operation when he was the Prime Minister in 1971. And the thinking behind it is very much like the thinking behind Gordon Brown taking interest rates out from Parliament and giving it to the Bank of England. One of the good things that Brown did was he realized that there was too much opportunity to play politics with interest rates, and that would destabilize the economy. So he took it out, gave it to the experts, the Bank of England. Well, Callaghan was there before then. In 1971, he said, drug legislation is too important to be left to the politicians. They will mess it up. They will make hay with it. So he gave it to the ACMD, an independent body that made decisions about the harms of drugs, put them into these three